Hi, welcome to today's webinar. I'm JD Gunnell with USU Extension. Today we're going to be talking about pruning landscape trees and shrubs. It's my goal to help remove some of the hesitation and fear associated with pruning. And even though we're not going to be talking about specific trees and shrubs, we're going to give you some general information that may help alleviate some of that fear. First of all, let's talk about hand tools. Hand pruners, or shears are sometimes called, are really important to keep sharp. They can cut branches up to an inch. Anything larger than that, you want to get some loppers. These vary in their sizes with their handles. You can see here some longer handled loppers. One of the most important features on a lopper, however, are these bumper pads. They help alleviate some of the stress on your elbows and joints as you are cutting branches for long periods of time. Now, with branches that are larger, 2 inches and above, you want to make sure you get a pruning saw. It helps make the project go a little bit better. And just like anything else in life, you get what you pay for. We're not going to talk about specific brands, but you do want to spend a little bit of money and get some good quality pruning tools. There are two basic pruning style tools. One is called a bypass pruner. These cut much like scissors. They have a sharp blade that goes past a cutting surface. These have a really nice motion. They cut smoother and make it easy for that pruning cut to seal over in time. The anvil type pruners I don't recommend because they have a flattened area that the blade presses against, and the tissue is typically crushed more than it is cut. And so it makes it more difficult to make good, clean pruning cuts. Now, generally speaking, the timing of pruning in the Intermountain West is during the dormant season. The reason we do this is you can see the structure of the plants. And that's the main thing that we're pruning for, is to have good, strong branches. I've often heard in the industry that you can prune in any month that doesn't end in R. So you want to avoid the fall and early winter months because pruning stimulates growth. In those months, the trees and shrubs are trying to go dormant. You don't want to encourage new growth. It's also mentioned that trees and shrubs that bloom early in the spring, you want to wait until after they've bloomed to get full benefit of the blossoms. These are often plants that have formed those blossoms the previous year. So if you prune them early, you're pruning off those blossoms. And along the Wasatch Front, especially, it becomes important to wait to prune roses until the threat of hard freezes is past. Usually it's in April once those buds have started to swell. I'd like to reiterate that pruning does not stop growth. It's one of the biggest misconceptions for people pruning. Pruning actually encourages new growth. It redirects what the plant is going to grow this current season into the branches that remain. It can encourage flowering and fruiting in some plants that we'll talk about. And don't be scared. Pruning is a lot like a bad haircut. It will grow back. More often than not, you're not going to kill the plant through your pruning practice. The worst thing you can do is not to prune at all. The reasons we prune, another big misconception, is that we can keep plants the size we want them. And though pruning does alleviate some of the growth height on a plant, the eventual size of the plant is determined by the genetics. And so there's very little you can do to control that. The most frustration I see in gardeners is trying to keep a 15-foot shrub at 5 feet. You will become very, very frustrated if you're trying to do that. So make sure you purchase the right plant to begin with. Now, starting to prune is one of the hardest things to do. And so I start with easy cuts, I call them. These are the dead wood, diseased wood, any branches that are rubbing or competing. This picture to the right is a hackberry, and you can see the branches that are rubbing against each other, causing wounds. And then we also want to alleviate weak angled branches when they're young, those that are less than 45 degrees. And I'll show you a picture in just a little bit. Suckers and water sprouts are also growth that don't help the plant, and I'll show you some pictures of those. And so this slide has a couple of pictures of included bark. These are branches that have really tight angles, and it prevents the bark from forming correctly and actually folds down into itself in the crotch angles of the branches. And so this branch, for example, is not connected to the other branch until you get clear down here at the bottom. So you get any weight on this branch, and what happens is this included bark will tear and rip. This is a willow tree. Willows are very susceptible to included bark. Zelkova is another one. That's this picture. And linden trees. So when the trees are young, make sure that you look for the tight, narrow crotch angles and remove any of those trouble branches. This slide pictures on the left suckers coming off of a crabapple. Suckers are those upright growths that come off of the roots, and so you want to dig down and cut or remove those suckers because they're not doing anything for the tree. Water sprouts, on the other hand, like are pictured in the right, these are vertical upward growths within the canopy of the tree, and these are also not wanted because they shade the interior of the tree. And so these are some growths that you can start with and remove and get a good start to your pruning. The good news is when you approach a plant, there's only 2 cuts that you can possibly make, and most people can remember 2 things. These 2 cuts are heading cuts and thinning cuts. The difference with the 2 cuts isn't on what you're doing, it's on how the plant is going to respond to those cuts. Heading cuts are taking and shortening a branch or a shoot to a bud. And what that does is encourages lateral growth or bushy growth behind that cut. An example of this would be shearing, or in extreme cases, topping. The thinning cuts, on the other hand, are removing an entire branch or shoot to a lateral and redirecting that growth to those other remaining branches. This helps open the canopy of the tree and shrubs for more light. Now it's important to realize what is happening in the plant's response to these two different cuts. And to do that, we have to talk about buds. This slide is picturing the terminal bud, which is here on the end of the branch, and lateral buds that go clear down the branch. The terminal bud is the one in charge. It sends hormones down the branch to control the lateral bud growth. So if you come in with a heading cut, for example, and cut right above this lateral bud, what ends up happening is that hormone, the suppression, is ended. And so you get all these buds behind the terminal bud popping and growing. That's why you get bushy growth with heading cuts. Here's another illustration. The picture on the left is a heading cut, shortening a branch, and a thinning cut on the right side is showing the removal of an entire branch. This is a picture of a tree that has been topped in years past. This is a very extreme form of heading, and we don't recommend this at all. What ends up happening is these lateral buds that are behind the cut end up popping, and you get these water sprout growths the first year, and these are very weakly connected to the main limbs, and they end up breaking with any kind of weight. Now this is an extreme thinning cut example. We've all seen these trees pruned under power lines. Even though it's a funny looking cut, it's actually a more sound cut for the tree, and it can regrow, and you can see the direction is reallocating that energy into the branches that are remaining. When you're making thinning cuts, we also call them natural target cuts. And the reason we call them that is there's two targets you look for in removing a branch. The first target is called a branch bark ridge here on the top. The other is the branch collar. It's this swollen area where the trunk tissue and the branch tissue connect. This becomes important because you don't want to do flush cuts. For example, if you were to come and do a flush cut, you're actually removing trunk tissue instead of just branch tissue, and it makes it very difficult for that wound to seal over. Here's an example of some stubs that are left. This is a poor pruning cut. What ends up happening is, like this picture on the right, the stub makes it nearly impossible for that healing callus wood to seal that wound over, and so you've actually introduced rot into the heart of that tree. And the picture to the left is actually my neighbor's tree, and the next year all these stubs contain latent buds, or buds that are asleep, lateral buds, that end up popping and causing a big mess of water sprouts later. So don't leave stubs. But also, this is a slide picturing what happens if you get too close to the branch collar. In the example to the left, you can see the collar was ripped or removed, and the top portion, the branch bark ridge on this cut, was removed. And so instead of getting this nice callusing clear around the branch, you get this U-shape or horseshoe shape. If you make a correct cut, what you should see is a donut, this callus wood that goes clear around the branch, and in time that seals completely over and compartmentalizes against any rot from entering into those wounds. Now, it's good to mention at this point that pruning sealants or pruning glues are not recommended for pruning cuts. The reason for that is these wounds heal within minutes of being cut and naturally. And so these pruning sealants actually lock moisture into those cuts and make it a prime location for fungal or other pathogenic diseases to grow. Now, if you're making a large cut or removing a large branch, there's what we call the 3-cut rule. And I will show you in some slides coming up an illustration of what this looks like. But what you want to do is make an undercut further out from the branch bark ridge and collar, and this ensures that the weight of the branch as it comes down doesn't tear into the trunk tissue. The second cut, you go further out on the branch. We call it the rough cut. You remove the majority of the weight of that branch. And then you can come in with that stub left and make a final cut just on the outside of the branch bark ridge and the collar. So here's a picture of an undercut. This is just the insurance. And then we'll go out, remove most of the weight of that branch. In this case, the branch didn't tear. And then we'll come back in with the third cut and remove that branch back to the branch bark ridge and the collar. Now, as mentioned before, here's a picture of a tree where that undercut wasn't made and the weight of the branch tore down and opened up this interior of the tree to rot, because it's going to be really difficult for that tree to seal that wound over. Now, in pruning large shrubs, examples of lilacs, forsythia, viburnum, dogwood, or mock orange, these plants typically, not always, but typically will flower on 1-year-old wood. And the newer the wood, the more flowers are formed. And so sometimes the older wood is not wanted. And so what we do is called renewal pruning, where we'll go in and remove the oldest canes clear to the ground. And what that does is encourage new suckering at the base of the plant And it also reduces the height of the plant without shearing because you're removing some of the oldest, tallest wood. There's example of smaller shrubs such as spirea, potentilla, blue mist, butterfly bush, Russian sage, and barberry that will actually promote flowers and produce flowers on new growth. And so with those, we shear fairly heavily and cut them back within 6 to 12 inches of the ground on some of the varieties. And what this does is it encourages new growth. And on that new growth, you'll have a lot more flowers. Now with evergreens, this becomes really important to emphasize that you plant the right one to begin with. There's not a lot of size control that you can do in pruning evergreens. There are some exceptions to the rules. Some of the evergreens that tolerate shearing are boxwoods or euonymus, arborvitae, or the upright junipers. But typically the spruce, pine, fir, and cedars, those with needles, do not tolerate heavy pruning. They have what's called candle growth in the spring, and typically all you can do is pinch about 1/3 of that candle off at any moment. So again, make sure you plant the right plant when it comes to evergreen especially. Now with roses, the most popular roses are hybrid teas or Floribundas. These are the ones with the big flowers for cutting. Again, you want to wait until mid-April after the buds have swollen. Again, because you're promoting new growth, and that new growth is very susceptible to frost damage. The one thing to consider with roses is they, again, will produce flowers on new growth, and so you're pruning them fairly heavily. And it becomes really important on roses of the growth you're leaving behind is more important than the growth that you're cutting away. So what you want to end up with is about 3 to 5 main canes that are 12 to 24 inches tall. And with the heading cuts that you're going to be shortening the existing canes, make sure you cut to an out-facing bud, because those buds are the new direction of that growth. So if you were to cut to a bud that was facing inward, the growth would grow inward, and what you want is an open vase allowing a lot of sun to penetrate the inside of that plant. The more sun equals better flowers. Now, this may sound contradictory when I mentioned pruning ceilings before, not using them in pruning cuts. Roses are the exception, rather. You want to seal the cuts against insects because the new cuts are very attractive to insects laying eggs, such as cane borers. These are some older pictures and a little bit blurry, but it shows a rose before and a rose after pruning. And you can see there's been a lot of growth taken off, and it becomes really important of what you leave. And that will give you some really nice flowers this season. Another thing to mention on roses is deadheading. It's a type of pruning, but all you're doing is removing the spent blossoms and trying to encourage those to rebloom later in the season. And what you'll want to do is go down to the first 5 leaflet. You just count these leaflets, 2, 4, 5, and you cut just above that, about 1/4 inch above those leaflets. And then you'll get new blossoms forming for that fall. I get a lot of questions on climbing roses, so it's worth spending a little bit of time. Climbing roses produce flowers on older wood that is 1 year old. And so instead of pruning them heavy, what you're going to try to do is prune them to the structure that they're climbing on. Most of these will also rebloom, but what you're looking at is cutting the lateral growth to about 4 to 6 buds per lateral, leaving the main canes to form the structure. Once the canes have reached 3 years old, the old, biggest, gnarliest canes, you'll remove those and only allow canes to grow the first 3 years. Now wisteria, one of the most common questions I get is I have a wisteria and it's not blooming, it's just growing. And a lot of that could be based on improper pruning practices. It's also important to realize that wisteria bloom on one-year-old wood, much like a grape. And so what you're trying to do is encourage that new growth, that one-year-old wood, but at the same time leaving enough buds to form those flowers. So it becomes really important to do 2 prunings. One in the summertime, where you'll go in and shorten the new vigorous growth by about half, leaving 4 to 6 buds on those vines. And then coming in later during the dormant season when the leaves are all gone and shortening those remaining vines even further to 2 to 3 buds. And these buds are what bear the flowers for that next season. So the take-home message is remove the fear from pruning. It doesn't stop growth, so make sure you get the right plant in the right area. And make sure the wood that you leave, you put more thought into than the wood you're cutting away. Start with the easy cuts. Remove any of the dead, diseased, or branches that are rubbing, the suckers, the water sprouts, any of the angles that are too tight that will form included bark. Start removing those first. And then it becomes easy. Doing nothing is the worst option. Thanks for watching, and make sure that you check out our other webinars at extension.usu.edu/webinars.